is June 24th. It's approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're going to be holding a marijuana advisory committee meeting talking about the non-producer licensing pause, the 2021 legislative session, and then medical access at OLCC retail stores for medical marijuana patients. And so to get us started, I don't think we need to do introductions today. I think we all know each other and we've done that before. We can go ahead and get started. Jason, if you want to get us started with the licensing pause, that would be fantastic.
I'd be happy to. Hello, everybody. So we've made quite a bit of headway in the last year and a half. Most of you know that. We're at a place where it's time to evaluate our current and non-producer pause. As you remember, we've got two pauses in place. Producer pause directed by Senate Bill 218. Today, this conversation is not intended to talk about that because that's set to sunset in January. So it's not on the table for discussion today. If you have questions, you can feel free to ask. But the focus of today's pause is the pause that we established in June 2018 for all other license types at this point that we do have control over. A big part of the effort in the last year and a half has been to get us into a place where we can lift that pause and continue processing applications that have been received after June 15th, 2018, non-producer applications. We continue to receive applications at a really slow pace. And at last check, we have roughly 220 eligible applications that have been received after the pause. These are, again, non-producer applications that are currently waiting for this pause to be lifted that would then be eligible to be processed. Previous to the pause, we've got roughly 200 applications to work through. So in total, about 450 or so applications, non-producer. Well, excuse me, this is where it gets confusing. Previous to the pause, we still have producer applications that are eligible to be processed that are a part of that pre-pause group. So that's the initial, 250 that are still eligible. That's of all license types. Okay. So from June 15th forward, we have roughly 220 applications that are non-producer because the Senate Bill 218 didn't allow you to apply for a producer license at that point. So when we receive applications at this, that were received after June 15th, they would be inactivated. Okay. So there are currently no eligible producer applications that are post-pause. If that's not confusing, if it is, obviously raise your hand and I can try to clarify that more. But yep, go ahead, Jesse.
I just so let me restate it as I understand it so I can verify that I understand. Basically what you said is there are 250 licenses of all types pre-pause that are able and will be theoretically processed by the OLCC no matter what. There are 200-ish applications post-pause, which exclude obviously producer licenses. So in total, we have approximately 250 licenses that could be processed in total.
You were right up until the end. Okay. So in total, it's roughly 450 between the post-pause and pre-pause.
Oh, sorry.
But your breakdown of the two is correct. Yes.
Sorry if I misspoke. Yes, 450 was the number in my head. If it's not the number that came out of my mouth.
Yeah. Well, you're on a roll. You said it better than I did. So yes, that's where we're at. So we've got a group right now, if we were to lift the pause today, of roughly 450 eligible applications. Half of that is the pre-pause group that we're working through. Those of you who are a part of any of those applications, we have our readiness process that has really been a great process for us that is establishing people's ability to be licensed within the 60 days that is in rule. And so up until recently, we've established basically a 30-day timeline, if not better than 30 days, for any application that has been notified. We've been notified that they're ready to be assigned. So they're being assigned within 30 days. So if you submit your readiness checklist, generally you get assigned within 30 days. Side note, the rest of our applications, that's also our goal. So whether you apply for a change of location, a change of ownership, a business structure change, an alteration, or a new application, the goal is that when we receive it, our long-term goal is that it'll be assigned within 30 days. We were maintaining that for a significant period of time over the last year. That, you know, and then from the point of assignment, our average, at least for the month of June, for so far this month, for licenses issued in June, we were 64 days. So from the date of assignment to the date of issuing the license, it's taken 64 days. So we're meeting our target pretty much. Now we've slowed down a bit. 1 second, Jesse. We are backed up to about 6 weeks right now. When we threw basically, ideally I'd like all applications to be in one bucket, because I don't want, it's more complicated to have to try to compete interests between all the different things that happen. So the goal is, regardless of what you request from us, these are the timelines we're trying to meet. Make it easy for everybody to understand. It's less prioritization issues for us. So when we started moving to that direction, now we're a little behind a little bit. We're down about 6 weeks right now to be assigned, instead of that 30 days. Once you notify us, you're ready. Jesse Peters had a question. I'm
sorry, and maybe I apologize for being a couple minutes late. Maybe you already went over this, but of those 450 licenses, how many of them are producers?
You know, I don't have that offhand. The majority of them, the 220 or so that are pre-pause, I would say are producers. I can pull that up when I finish my portion and we move on to other parts of the agenda. I will make a note to grab that and let you know.
Thank you.
Just to double down on that, Mike Gatlin put a question in the chat about, you know, what is the breakdown of those 450 license types? So
yeah, I can I don't have it. Won't be able to gather it in this meeting for the post-pause, but I do have it for the pre-pause. So half of that I could give you the breakdown of license type today. I can get the rest at a later time.
Have there been no new licenses being processed then since the pauses?
No, we've been continuing to issue licenses since the pause. Those that have been applied for pre-pause up to that June 15th date. So we've continued, you know, if you recall, when we started, you know, early last year, March 2020, when we really doubled down on the work that we were doing, we had roughly 1,100 or just over 1,000 applications that were eligible to be assigned, to be processed, that pre-pause group. We're down to that 250 number. So a whole bunch got processed, many got inactivated, many were withdrawn by the applicant. I don't have the ultimate breakdown there about which group, how much is in which group, but we're into that 250 or a little under 250 now that are pre-pause.
Thank you.
I have a question that might be helpful in general. Is the OLCC planning on reissuing or restarting those license breakdown emails or the notifications that we used to get, so we can kind of track where applications are? Like that used to happen, and I feel like with the pause that went away. I think that would be really helpful to bring back, you know, when we can see where applications are by license type, because that used to happen, those notifications that we used to get. That would be helpful for me. I don't know if that's something you guys are planning on bringing back as you open up licensing again.
Well, I can certainly tell you, I'm not aware of something that we stopped providing that way. So if you're speaking of, are you speaking of the website that the processing dates website and the information in that on that webpage?
Right.
Yeah, that's what she's asking about. It used to go out in a regular email, and now
exactly.
It's on the website.
Okay, is that what it is? It's on the website. Well, it'll be maybe, I don't know, maybe having it go back on email, or knowing that it's on the website, but having there be a little bit more accessibility to that would be helpful, I think, too.
Yes, and thanks, TJ. TJ put the link. I don't know if that's the actual. Oh, that's a PDF document. So there's a on our website, and it's updated ideally a couple times a month, if not weekly, depends on kind of how much movement we have. We have a marijuana processing date page on our website, and what this does is it gives you the information, the date that we're assigning from based on when you let us know you're ready. I also have several other things in the mix that we're going to be adding to that, which is going to include some charts showing average days to license from being assigned. So you'll have, you'll get a little bit of additional information there. What we stopped doing, that web page used to have a breakdown because we used to be broken up into teams, and teams within the program where you would be only working on 2 different license types. And so as we've worked through what we've done this last year and a half, we've got to a point to where we don't break things down anymore. You're not on a team, and you're not only focusing on a certain couple of license types. And the goal there is that, really I'd like to get to the point where, regardless of what you've applied for, you're in line based on when you applied, and it's based on the date of accepting your application, a complete application. And so we moved away from that team approach because of that. So that website's updated a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
But Megan, if you feel free to email me what you were referring to, and that will help me understand what you were getting that you are not getting anymore. If you have access to a previous email or notice.
Yeah, I'll see if I can dig through the archives. Thank you, Jason.
Mm-hmm. So again, the topic on the table is lifting the non-producer pause. That's been the intention, and really we'd like to hear your thoughts. I've got some operational ideas in mind. I don't necessarily want to get into all of that today, but I would like to hear. We all would like to hear your thoughts around what that looks like from your perspective, how it might impact the industry and your clients, and with just a caveat that we don't have a specific plan in place yet. We haven't agreed upon a plan. No guarantees of what that will look like, but it's important to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for the chance to comment, Jason, and just generally to the licensing team. I think it's fair to say OLCC has made a lot of headway over the last year. It's certainly nowhere near perfect yet, but I appreciate all the many long hours and clear effort that folks have been putting in on this. My big, just from the folks I talk to, clients in local jurisdictions, if OLCC is going to lift the pause, I just hope it would be really intentional about it and make sure that it's doing it in a way that's actually serving the stakeholders. I just am not hearing from local jurisdictions that they feel like they don't have enough cannabis businesses or from consumers or licensees. So I'd say if it's going to do it, go get some stakeholder feedback first. Having this committee get together is great. I love to, have industry folks chime in, but there's a lot of people who would be impacted by opening it back up. And I hope the agency doesn't rush to do anything.
Yeah, and I'll jump in quickly and kind of echo a little bit of that, and also a thanks for the volumes of work everybody over there has put in to speed this process up. I don't think that there's any argument that we don't have enough cannabis businesses in the state of any license type. And I don't think we have anybody saying that demand is not being sufficiently met by the current infrastructure. We've got obviously the producer license conversation is going to be a much more complicated one that's probably going to involve some legislative work next year, and we've been kind of preparing to figure out what maybe some of the salient points of that conversation need to be. But I think this too is part of the same conversation. The legislature is going to need to sit and take a look at this in a holistic way and say, okay, well, what do we want to do with this licensure system? It's a powerful tool to keep the market stable. And I think that there is some conversations that we plan to be having even in the short session next year to figure out, what we want it to look like. And so I think I'll echo, Will's sentiment. Many of us have an interest in being able to process new licenses to expand our businesses, but, simply cracking it open and putting 450 plus new licensees into circulation and all of the strain and wear and tear on the agency that would entail, while you guys have a lot on your plate for a million other things going on at the same time. That's our concern. So, if I had snapped my fingers, it would be okay, if we're going to do this, a very slow, measured approach, keeping an eye on those turnaround times, what happens to those 64 days if you're adding, even 20 licenses, to that, if not, nearly 500. So, I think that what I would love to see is a slow walk on this, quite frankly, where, like Will said, a lot of industry feedback, maybe some surveys, a very deliberate process, because a couple things happen on day one. Even if you guys send an email out that you're going to start issuing new, start doing these licenses again, you're going to kill millions and millions of dollars of asset value from a lot of small businesses where the license is the only thing they've got. Deals in the pipeline that are about to close next week will get killed for hundreds of thousands of dollars that are keeping people out of bankruptcy. So, you have, not that I'm saying anything you haven't thought through a million times, but it's a really big deal, and it's going to hurt a lot of people if it's not done, in a very deliberate fashion. So that's kind of, my feedback. And, I obviously don't speak for everybody, but I know Jesse and Kim and Amanda and a lot of us have been kind of noodling on this a little bit. So,
Mike,
well,
I want to just ask, does that change is your view different about the 250 we've had, the 250 or however 200, 250 that we have, and under the administrative process, right? So those within that 450 number that we were talking about, are you talking about those as well as the legislative pause ones? Because I view those a little different myself philosophically. One's we actively got in front of because other businesses got there first, but we did sort of say we're going to get to you. And then the legislature jumped in. Do you view those differently?
So I'm of two minds on it. Part of me says, if we collectively as a state, tell a potential business owner that, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, then I think we have a moral responsibility to fulfill that, even if it takes a long time. So I do agree with you, Steve. I from a kind of a business moral standpoint, I think that there's a strong argument that those pre-pause guys have got to go. But from a market stability standpoint, we are all just finally getting our feet under us. Every license type, there's no license type where people are printing money and more competition will drive better results for the market. So I think there are really two conflicting interests there that probably can be satisfied with a measured pace of licensure. But and a very measured, slow walk also probably helps avoid a crash in the secondary market pricing on licenses as well. So yeah, that's a tough one. But the longer term question, I think, really is a legislative one. The legislature's gonna have to make a decision about what they want, the agency doing in terms of new applications that haven't yet been submitted. So.
Well, I think that both as to the ones that were paused and as to the ones that are going to start up again the end of January, that there are legal constraints involved as well. I think that you have to process the ones that were paused, and I think that moving forward, I know that 3 federal courts have struck down out-of-state restrictions on cannabis businesses as unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is what we were concerned about when we were drafting Measure 91. If we want to restrict it, though, I mean, I remember in 2015 when the Rules Advisory Committee was meeting and going forward with different kinds of licensing schemes, that there were, merit schemes that were considered, and that might be something for the agency to consider and invite feedback on when speaking with the various stakeholders.
Hey, I thought initially in the initial draft of the legislation, there was a provision that empowered the OLCC to issue licenses commensurate to the demand, so to balance the supply relative to the demand. And I'm not sure what happened to that and why that cannot be invoked in order to.
Did it say that, Bo? Wasn't it we had to balance the supply between indoor and outdoor?
No, it was that you were empowered to issue licenses commensurate to the demand. And so that would kind of take this whole equation off of the, once you process the residual license.
I think the supply and demand issue is the requirement that the agency report annually on that. Yeah. I think that's where that language is. In the reports that they file with the legislature about where things are relative to so that the legislature can take action once it has that information. I'm not recalling.
Are you speaking to back in 2014, or are you speaking to, what are you speaking to? Which legislation? I mean, we've got, so the 218 required that we do an annual report to address for 218 producers specifically. The supply and demand report is a biannual report.
No, this was a very early on in the Joint Committee on implementing Measure 91, and the rules that came out from that I'm very confident that it said that OLCC could issue licenses relative to the demand and size it that way. But I'll have to go back.
Yeah, Bo,
but
I just checked 475B. It's not there now, so I don't know where it went. But I just checked it. It doesn't list it currently.
I don't remember you guys advocating for a closed system back then. Everyone wanted us to go gangbusters and let everyone in, is what I recall.
No, it wasn't advocating a closed system. It just empowered you to analyze the supply versus demand and then react accordingly. So.
There is the 20-pound transfer from the medical system, and one of the safety valves on that is that the agency can determine if supply is in excess of demand, the agency can cut off that 20-pound transfer. So it might be that you're thinking of, because that came out of the Joint Committee.
Can I ask a question, Steve? You mentioned separating out those kind of two buckets. Let's call them those who were pre-pause promised licenses that kind of got caught up from the post-pause. Hope they go. Is there a viable potential option on the table whereby you guys are picking away at the earlier ones and table the rest until post-session 22 when we can kind of have a holistic conversation about this?
I do think I kind of think that's what's on the table, is like, do we have to process, and how quickly do we process what we have? I think we will need to see what the legislature does, right? That's what we're talking about, the effect of the legislature, what it does next session or next year, right? Is it 2022 next year? And so we had a good discussion with Kim London and her crew. They passed a meeting, and so I was impressed with some of that discussion that I hadn't thought about before. So I want to make sure that everyone at the advisory, one of the things we talked about is sort of the obligation of those the old applicants, which I sort of feel like we have an obligation to. If we don't legally, I sort of feel like we said we were getting to you. We just weren't going to get to you anytime soon. Tell your investors it's over a year out and we're holding you out there. But we did talk about one of the concepts that came into play was not just where we're at currently, because we got a lot of supply. We all kind of know that, and we got a pretty prolific retail base. Now, I wasn't talking about, in my context, we were only talking about producer licenses, but we did talk about if interstate opens up, being limited as current licensees to like the outdoor grow 1 acre probably doesn't make commercially viable sense. From what are we going to do? our greatest folks with expertise, who probably have more farmland or more land to be able to grow on, are limited from using that to 1 acre, and we're proliferating these 1 acre grows going forward. So I think that's a consideration for, do we imprimatur or something when interstate commerce, the doors open and interstate commerce is here about that? Do we take that into account in any way? And what we say, or what you're talking about with the legislature and having a conversation with us about, it's like, so I began the frame of how do we best position Oregon through our work on licensing for interstate commerce, sort of assuming that my assumption is the doors are open in Oregon. But until that point in time, do we actually look at this problem as, how do you as an industry think about what maximizes Oregon's opportunity as interstate?
To break it up. So you said he may need to break up the palette.
I can hear you clear there, Steve. I think it's a great question and something the state needs to think about on all levels. How do we posture Oregon for success when the federal barrier comes down? I tend to think that we have sufficient supply for Oregon for the time being. But when that happens, we need to be able to turn quick and increase supply. And, as somebody who runs administrative permits all day, every day, what might be an elegant fix is just increasing the capacity for existing locations. Almost all the farms I've toured, indoor and outdoor, can expand that capacity if the state would let them, and could supply a whole bunch of product. But great question. And I really am glad to hear Oregon thinking about how to deal nationally.
Well, Steve, I can tell you that I'm on the board for the Alliance for Sensible Cannabis for Sensible Markets with Adam Smith. We talk about this obviously all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's two issues. I mean, I really appreciate the OLCC's already having the foresight to look at that and look at where that issue is going to go. But currently the border's closed, and we're aware of the fact that even when we do get an interstate compact, if Governor Newsom signed something tomorrow with Kate Brown to have an interstate compact, it would take a substantial amount of time, probably looking at the better part of, if not longer than a year, just to set the system up to be able to make those transfers, which in that time frame gives the OLCC a chance to start ramping licensing back up, and looking at things like, is that an option for all the producers that want to expand their grow, get their first shot at expansion before we issue new licenses, because they've suffered through this market, they made it all this far, they worked that hard to get here, and that kind of then cascades back down to pre-opening up the borders and looking at production rates. I mean, most of the producers we talk to could scale up to a 5 to 10x of what they produce right now in their current facility without even touching anything. And their OLCC is not stopping them. They're keeping themselves back because the market's just not there. So their ability to expand and meet demand on the secondary product outside of the flower can happen exceptionally fast. And thus it leads back to, and I appreciate what Mike was saying, it leads us back to a situation where, it was great. We opened this place up and everybody worked really hard and licenses got put out and the market crashed and lots of people lost their retirements. They lost their 401ks. I guarantee you there are people sitting in the queue right now begging to get a license for a producer that are blinded by what's potentially going to happen when we up our production in the state by 20 to 40% if they all get pushed through. And that cascades down to every secondary business. If we do have to issue the licenses for the 220 that are left in the queue on a moral obligation because we said wait, I think it's something we roll out really slowly just to help prevent the damage, not only to the companies that are already here so that everybody can settle into it, but also to the companies that are getting ready to open up, almost helping them not get out over their skis like we did when we all pushed out in the very beginning and found ourselves getting $100 a pound for cannabis 90 days later. So I do think it's a very deliberate, very cautious thing if we roll out any more of these licenses, so that we don't fracture the very fragile market that we just got back on its feet and are finally starting to get some value. companies who can look at their license and say, you know what, I don't want to play anymore, and it's worth $250,000. Or I could get this for my company because nobody else you can get a license. As soon as, just like Mike said, as soon as we open up the gates to start taking new applications, that's over. Those deals that are sitting on the table now will be done. Any pubco or any large company that's buying companies right now is letting their LOIs die on the vine if they're looking to buy them outright and not keep the operating team.
So Jesse, some statistics on that. With the decrease in pricing, there was a documented spike in farmer suicides as well. And so there was not only an economic toll, but a personal one as well. But, you know, I track the number of licenses that are issued by category, by state every month. And so Oregon sits at one of the highest levels of, or lowest levels of population per retail outlet. And so there's already a saturation of retailers relative to the general population. It ranks 4th in the United States. And at the same time, the ratio of cultivator to retailer is among the highest in the country. And so we have this situation where we have a lot of suppliers for these retailers, and a lot of a tremendous amount of retailers, you know, already in the system. So, you know, I've done a lot of work on at the federal level on 280E and rescoring it. And part of this, the justification for rescoring is social equity, but another justification is the economic viability of the people that are impacted by 280E. And so there's a federal state dynamic here. But if you increase the number of retailers, then the number of businesses below that threshold of economic viability is going to increase. And so it's just going to put people at risk of going out of business just because of the way that the demand is settling.
Can I ask you a question? So Jesse mentioned the price for a license, basically, and I don't know if anyone has experience on this side of the house, but does anyone have any insight into what an alcohol license would cost to buy from an existing business?
It's an excellent question. I mean, yeah, well, sorry.
You can't buy an alcohol license in Oregon. Take Colorado.
You can't buy a marijuana license in Oregon either. You have to go through a transfer of ownership. That's my question. Is what is the market for an alcohol license?
There is not a material market. It's the business, but it doesn't have independent value like it does on cannabis and other heavily regulated areas.
We have no caps on bars.
So I want to add a bit of a wrench to this conversation that I don't think was intended when it was developed. Some of you were a part of this bill, Senate Bill 408, and specifically the beginning portion of it describing or changing when OLCC may delay processing, approving, or denying an application. It's changed things up for us a bit. With this bill, at this point, I question our ability to even, I mean, we can say we're not getting your application because we have others in front of you. But there will be a time where I think this bill is going to impact our ability to put a pause on processing applications.
You know, that was definitely something that you know, we had all talked about, you know, with that bill. And I think, you know, again, I have to say, what I keep going back to through all of this is that, you know, there are, you know, we need to have clear guidance from the state, from the legislature on what we are trying to accomplish with the licensure system. And, you know, going back to the way it was set up, I mean, we're still operating off of the remnants of a framework where the major concern was involving as many black market participants in the new legal licenses system as possible. And, you know, that concern leads to one set of outcomes, and we've dealt with that and stabilized the market through, you know, a variety of efforts, both from industry and OLCC over these last few years. But I think that in order to really get this right, we must have a holistic statewide conversation about what we want the licensure system to look like. What are we trying to accomplish? And from my standpoint, the answer to that is we want to provide as much stability as possible to allow existing licensees to survive and hopefully continue to slowly expand until we have a nationwide market and can really, be poised to compete there. And especially, I'm hopeful that we're going to defeat Senate Bill 864 and not have a 10%, across the board local tax on all cannabis purchases. But, that is, even if we win this one, that is an opening salvo in what is going to be a complex battle over the coming years. And, if you add, another 10, 15, 20% to the number of retail outlets in the state each year, and on top of that are increasing their effective tax rate by 7%, which is not going to be absorbed by customers. It could be, blood in the streets again. You could have the exact same thing happen to retailers that we saw happen to producers in 2017-18. And that doesn't help anybody. We're just driving product back to the black market. And so, I think that, you've got, you're not doing those producer applications pre-pause for a while anyway. So, if you got 30 retailers and, 50 processors and a handful of wholesalers that are in that pre-pause, and, we can slow walk those without clogging the pipes too much. Maybe that's a good solution. And then maybe everything else, we go and try and work together on a legislative package next year that gives clear guidance as to what we're trying to do, at least up and until, changes in federal law. And I think that would be my vote. And I think that, hopefully if we do something like that, it doesn't clog the pipes too much. We don't go backwards on the great accomplishments the agency's done in terms of licensure processing recently. Sure, 30 retailers is meaningful, 52 processors is meaningful, but it's not going to blow a giant hole in the hull, and will give us an opportunity to both kind of guinea pig how long that processing of those applications takes, and kind of see where the needle lands in terms of the numbers that each of these kinds of businesses are doing. So, that might be kind of an elegant solution with decent political cover. And, if we need to go to the legislature and, get some comments on record as to, supporting that, if that's helpful, I think that might be something we could work on as well.
So there's another supply of licensees, those that go out of existence. And right now we allow the business ownership change. And people buy their way in on the business change all along. Now it allows consolidations of everything else. I'm just saying, I just wanted to point that out. There's something else to consider in our flow of who's getting licenses and when.
And that was kind of
there's a restriction a bit then on the small business local folks who want to get in, who didn't get in right away, who don't have the capital to spend $150,000 to get in right now. I mean, that's the flip side of this. Are we hurting the small business, the local folks?
And that's the great, and forgive me for chirping up a little much. I'll shut up after this, but that's a great question, Jason. I think that's something that kind of goes to the heart of the bigger questions around this. But we're right now, my company is working on a kind of a shared deal to set up an oil farm, basically the least expensive production facility we could possibly contemplate setting up just for crude oil and nothing else. And we're figuring on a $250,000 license purchase. And even that's less than 25% of the year one cap and OPEX that we're going to need to get the thing off the ground. And so, this idea that there are viable small business plans that can get into the Oregon marijuana market for, call it $100,000 in total CapEx, that doesn't exist. It's a fantasy that has been run over by the economic realities of this industry and primarily by 280E. You cannot start any license type with any hope of success in Oregon for much less than $1 million. And so, not that justifies the cost of secondary market license purchasing, but the fact, the idea that some small businesses would succeed if only they could get into the market without having to purchase a license, I think is kind of a fantasy.
Mike,
honestly,
I would agree with Jason on that. I see it all the time. small business farmers, especially in Southern Oregon, who have land. They've got infrastructure, but they can't afford the $200,000 to $300,000 to buy a license. They've got every, so it really is a hindrance to have that to them. I think there are people who can make it if they didn't cost, they didn't have to pay the $250,000. But I understand there's a lot of producers, a lot of retailers. I haven't heard anybody talk about, is there too many processors out there right now? Are there too many wholesalers? Maybe the OLCC could look at, the other license types, pushing the wholesalers through, pushing the processors if there's not too many processors. So that's kind of what I'm interested in hearing from the OLCC at this moment.
I've got all that data. I think I can run those numbers at least to show, processors per retailer, per cultivator, and relative to other states. I can do that. That's pretty easy. I've got all the data already.
Jason, though, I would go back to kind of what you had mentioned about that 150,000 and hurting the small company. And I'd kind of lean back towards keeping in mind, except for a small few, everyone who's in existence right now was the small company. Most of us, and those who are still fighting, are still the small company. And by taking and saying, hey, we know that you refinanced your house twice and almost lost everything you owned through the crash, and we finally got the market stable and you were a small company, but we want to give another small company a chance that hasn't seen the market yet and doesn't realize the heartache that you've been through, and we're just going to open that door again. Cresco isn't here. Like, this isn't the land of Nevada where it's pretty much a fight between Verano, GTI, and every other big player in the market. All of us that came up in this market, for the most part, fought and scrapped and are still here fighting and scrapping. And so opening that up to the 150, as much as I can understand that notion of, we don't want it to be a heavy burden on a company that maybe they only got 150 grand to get a business started, but that's how we all got here. And we earned that spot through a lot of tears and fighting.
I have to disagree with the idea that there are small players that haven't been able to compete successfully at any license level. I represent a broad range of businesses, from including, I have worked with publicly traded companies, but mostly the work that I'm proudest of is the kind of stuff that Jesse's talking about, people who transitioned from the traditional market to medical, and then from medical to adult use. And when we drafted 91, we figured that the market would sort things out, and I still think that's the case. I remember talking with Kopelak afterwards, particularly when the consolidation happened, since he's an old merger and acquisitions lawyer, and I asked him, am I going to have to go to the weed store to buy weed that was grown by a weed company and processed by weed processors and sold? It's all vertically integrated, it's all the same thing. And he said that he imagined that, as with food, that there would be Albertsons and Safeways, but there'll also be Whole Foods and New Seasons, and there'll also be little bodegas and whatnot. So I continue to favor, my 2 cents is that, and I know that the legislature doesn't give a shit about the will of the people, or they would have enacted the tax system that we had proposed, for example, instead of enacting a sales tax, when the people have rejected sales taxes 8 times in the state. But the will of the people in 91 was that it be open, and that the market sorted out. And I just wanted to put in my 2 cents for that approach going forward.
I just wanted to say, from the producer farmer perspective, that we've had long conversations about this as well. And for current licensees, they would be more interested in paying a high cost for a license than opening up the floodgates to get a $6,000 license as opposed to a $100,000 license. It's just, it's how they feel about it. The conversation of possibly expanding what they have, we produce at such a small rate than what we can here because of what the Oregon market is. We need to allow that for what the current licensees have if we're looking at that sort of expansion, because the conversations we have on the reason we want export is to not have these big facilities popping up everywhere for it. So allow those that can already do this without having to build more infrastructure.
Yeah, to add to his comments, we believe we're seeing signs of another oversupply situation building right now. So everything we can do to maintain market stability, it's crucial for us.
Yeah, I think Jesse and Mike hit the nail on the head. These small, we are an industry of small operators. There is no ANBEV equivalent in Oregon. If you look at the number of licenses out there and the percentage of production, nobody's near anything close to like market power. Or so when we say like big successful companies, we're still not talking about mega companies. And the single biggest asset for a number of these small retailers, small producers, is that license. And folks fought tooth and nail to build that value in their business. And, it would just take that away in a heartbeat if it was open completely back up. And I just feel terrible for these folks who, have to leave the market for whatever family reason, could get nothing. That's what happens on the alcohol side sometimes when folks have to shut up shop. And I just think that would not be in the public interest.
And I'd be really curious, maybe Bo, this might be something you could answer or might have some interest in looking into, but were we to start accepting new applications for any license type, obviously producers are the most tricky in that. How many of these would be local Oregon mom and pop operators versus how many of them would likely be out of state funded, MSOs trying to come in and grab up market share to dress up their investment prospectuses? That's the big problem is, if what we were really envisioning was a system where, us good residency requirement Oregonians could hash it out in some sort of libertarian utopia marketplace and generate great, business outcomes, then let's do it. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are large, international corporations with outside funding dumping, gajillions of dollars into Oregon, not caring if they generate positive revenue or not, just so that they can show how many licenses they have when they put themselves on the block for Anheuser-Busch someday. And so that's why, this idea, the original kind of utopian idea about this, let the market sort it out thing doesn't work when we've got access to outside capital, but no access to outside markets. So I think that's a big question. Like, sure, there's always a counterexample, of, a landowner who wants to plant, half an acre on their farm and, shore up their revenue. But like, how many of those are we talking about versus, mega operators that want to come in and lose money professionally?
Well, but what I would say to that, Mike, honestly, is what the system that we have right now and what we have in place with our licenses being on a pause, part of that value with us, with MSOs and big players, investment funds, all of us starting to look towards what happens when you can start sending cannabis outside of Oregon. What happens when we get an interstate compact and we can start playing that game here? And what happens in a limited license state with us on pause, which we have become, there's a lot of them, but still it's limited. That value there is huge now for the big players, the MSOs, to come in and start looking for a successful farm where they want to leave everybody in place. They want to keep everybody working, and they're going to pay big money to start being able to get these farms to the capital they need to expand and get bigger and consolidate so that we can meet the demand of 1 state, 3 states, 5 states, and on down the path. I agree with you in the fact that when we open this up fully, if that was what happened, then yes, as an MSO with $200 million in the bank, if it was me, I would walk in and I would turn in 300 applications under 300 LLCs, and I would reserve all my license spots and I would let them sit there. And then I would pull the trigger on driving price points down as soon as the markets opened up in other states so that I could drive my competition farms down into the ground. And then I would buy their farms when they were going under, and I'd ditch my licenses and just let them sit in the queue. And that's how you, and then I would lobby the legislature really heavily with all my money to try to shut licensing down at that point in time. So we're set up really good right now, but we open up that licensing gate. Anybody who's got that kind of money and is paying attention to what happens when we open the borders, that's their plan.
Thanks, Jesse. Danica, you've unmuted and muted several times. You haven't spoken. Did you want us to chat?
And yes, I do. And I apologize. I have a kid taking guitar lessons right now, so I'm trying not to leave it unmuted very long. Yeah, no, I want to agree with just all of these general market condition comments and concerns, because I think that was one of the reasons why the pause was put in place. But I want to really highlight the operational risks as well. I mean, the work you and your team have done, I think it really can't be understated since last summer, and this group got together and made recommendations. The streamlining you did, and then probably one of the most critical pieces is the predictability that you mentioned at the beginning of time to licensure, of just knowing that it's 30 to 60 days to get a license. That's huge for businesses. And I think there would be some tolerance for some lengthening of time as long as it stayed predictable, but not much, because that plus the relaxation of some of the financial interest requirements and disclosures, has led a lot of businesses that weren't able to grow easily before do that now. So I would just echo a lot of these same comments, but just, really consider, frankly, doing a market study of, each individual license type too. I do think that there might be reasons to consider opening up wholesale licenses, for example. There's a lot of companies that really need that more for some of the transfer privileges. And so it might be that, there is a difference between the different license types the agency could consider, and just that could be another mechanism to slow walk this, rather than just a free-for-all opening it up again. Thank you.
I think the OLCC needs to, if really there's a desire to enable interstate commerce as quickly as possible, then the OLCC needs to get legislative support to an approval to issue export licenses, even if those export licenses aren't granted yet. But if at least you have a mechanism to do that, then people that are growers now that have that designation as a license or potential license exporter, that would be huge for them, and it would be able to drive value for them as well. So it's just, it'll lay the foundation. That's just a thought.
Thanks, Bo. Jesse, why don't you want to speak?
Sorry, I'm going to turn off my camera because I'm in a hotel and my internet is really slow. I think in general, we've talked about a lot of different things, and we talked about how to deal with the current pause that's existing, how to deal with the pre-license, post-license pause. We talked about the farm licenses. We talked about interstate commerce and how that might affect the pause. In general, I just want to say one overarching thing is that whatever the OLCC chooses to do, I hope it does it slowly with great communication and education along the way, so everybody is able to have time to adapt and adjust and internalize the changes that are coming. That being said, part of the reason this is, I think we've had so many pieces of the conversation, is this is a really big issue. It's very complicated, and honestly, there's going to be losers no matter what we do, and there are values that need to get balanced, such as enabling people to enter the market fairly and have an opportunity to compete, versus also protecting existing licenses and not creating a system where everybody starves. And there are, and there's issues with outer state and in-state, we're competing with Florida, right? In some ways, where Florida companies that have licenses here, I'm in Florida, just so everybody knows, is, somewhere between $10 and $50 million. So you have that entity looking at going into a state that has a much lower barrier. We're not in a free market necessarily on the national level. There's lots of pieces to this. And so, honestly, I think this work group is a very great first start, but I also feel like it's the first start where we're balancing so many options and values. And I just think that this really needs a long conversation. And I also think it's not just within the hands of the OLCC to be able to do this through rules. I honestly think we have to engage the legislature and the governor's office on this and really have a clear discussion as an industry, because I've heard lots of different things from lots of different people, but everybody wants clarity and time to adapt at the bare minimum. But I really do think that the reason this is a very challenging question, and we have to be careful in how we do it, because other states I think have done a pretty bad job, and I'd like to avoid some of those foibles. And there are benefits to the open market system, and there are benefits to the more limited license model, and there are severe threats in the limited license in the open market system. As the reason we have the pause in the first place is because we can do, because the reason we have is people were selling $25 pounds of cannabis, and going bankrupt left, right, and center. That all being said, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I really think that the best thing we could advocate for at the moment is a concerted work group with the legislature, the OLCC, and industry participants over several months to really work out exactly, if not more, to really look at how this looks. In relation to export, obviously this essential will change the dynamic, but I do think that, looking at how we can enable those who are in the market to expand is really important, and an essential piece of that conversation. And I do agree that part of the reason that people are not going under left, right, and center is because they're not trying to produce as much possible cannabis as they can. They're growing for their marketplace in a way that they weren't able to do in 2017 and 18 because there wasn't enough information there. And so I think that the export conversation is also an essential piece of the conversation. I don't know how viable that is, but I can't think of anything smarter for OLCC and the legislature to do in relation to this. Well, I can think of lots of things, but I think it's an incredibly smart thing to do. And I look at California that just passed a bill that is giving $100 million to its industry to survive, right? Can we have a work group? Is sort of my question. And I know it's not entirely in the hands of the OLCC, but I think we should at least be able to get a work group.
Thanks, Jesse. I do want to recognize time. Matt, did you have something you wanted to say to this? I saw you unmuted.
I meant to turn my camera off. Sorry.
Okay. So I would like to close up this portion of it, and we can move on to the other items on the agenda. Does anybody else have any last minute, like short 10-second things they'd like to say, or is there anything you'd like to? There's a lot that was just said since you last spoke. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would just.
Can anybody hear me? This is Megan Lanier. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got both Jeanette and Megan. Jeanette, do you mind? Megan, could you hold 1 second? And Jeanette,
of course.
Go ahead.
Listening to this, it's interesting to me. There's just a philosophical choice. It's either the state with unlimited licenses that's much more pro small business, and maybe I'm missing a nuance here that you guys aren't laying out, or it's limited licenses. And I've heard some comments, but it also does make the state more attractive to those MSOs once we limit those licenses. I mean, that's in any conversation I've had with MSOs or other big funders, our unlimited licenses is why they're staying out, but it's also giving us the opportunity to be that state of small business. So I'm just really curious how that needle is possibly threaded. And I don't have an answer, but it does feel like, to me, two philosophical choices.
Thanks, Jeanette. You broke up a little bit, but I think I got the message. I think you're right. There are some philosophical choices here. And as everybody's acknowledged, right now we are at open market. I mean, that was the way this was set up. So Steve can speak more to this than probably any of us here. I don't know how much authority we can flex when the statutes read the way they do currently. So like Jesse said, engaging the legislature, a really important thing to do. So let's see. Who was next? Sorry, I forgot who spoke up.
That's okay. It's Megan Lanier. I called in.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't have the video situation going on, but we're going camping, so I'm sparing you guys the look I got going on. Anyhow, I think I also represent a lot of different businesses in the industry, and just listening to all your comments, and I concur with so many of them. The feedback I get a lot from the farmers is if licenses are to be thought of being opened up, letting them have the opportunity to expand first. So I think that was pretty much said today. And then also the overwhelming amount of flower that's in the market. I just got confirmation from another client of mine who owns a wholesale company, and he was just saying that it's about ready to get flooded. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But I also wanted to let you know that I was here, and I look forward to listening to what else we have to say.
Thank you, Megan, and enjoy your camping trip. Steve, do you want to have any closing remarks on this topic before we move on? You're muted there.
Yes, I appreciate the conversation, and there's just no doubt it's a given that the legislature has a say on what happens with the legislative pause, right? Whether it goes away or stays, sunset or it goes. They have to speak up on it, right? They don't have to take it up, but I'm pretty clear the industry is going to drive that question to them. And we should all be at the table and talking about that. You still got to figure out, you know, as we run the program, damned if you didn't tell Jason, get your act together and get that thing whipped up so licensing could produce. We did it. Now we got it done. You tell us, oh, stop that. You know, 1 year late. We can't run this from knee-jerk to knee-jerk either, right? I just got more licensing staff in Jason's shop, and now we're shutting her down. Or talking about that. So there's that aspect. I do think we have some obligation to figure out what we do with those OLCC pause ones and maybe meting them out with what we have in the system. So, but I've heard the go slow, be measured, and clearly, and take a dart, and we will wrestle with that. But no, I think we've got to at some pace do something with the licenses that are our pause licenses, not the legislature's, at some rate. But that shouldn't go so fast that it doesn't, one, that displaces us, two, that we're not having this conversation. The other point I'd make is I don't think as a choice, not that I like the idea of a complex system, but I don't think this is binary. A lot of these things work in combination that we've been talking about. The timing might be different on expansion of grows, or it might be predicated in the future when some market opens up. We do have to think about what we do with the buyouts of businesses on violations and settling. You know, whether that's a good system or a poor system for us, for generation of new licenses, because basically it means people that want to go buy a failed business. They're not going and talking to you about buying your business. You know, they're buying the ones that are coming available. You know, and so I think we got to think about all of those things. So I'll leave it right there. Jason, move us on.
Well, I'll give that mic back to Amanda because I think my part's completed.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for your engagement. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. So next on the agenda, we just had, this will be much quicker. We just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the 2021 legislative session. And Steve, I think there were some remarks you wanted to make.
I know. Remind me, Amanda, because I was sitting here thinking there's something I need to say specifically to this group that I wanted to convey somewhat. Will you get me chimed in here?
Yeah.
One, I want to thank, right, there's that. Thank you, industry. We had an incredible session together, I think, from everything that we've, you know, worked on the violations and making progress and let's get one. I think that was a really good frame for the future. Moreover, what I think it did is develop some of that confidence between us about what we want to achieve for the system. You know, it's imperfect, no doubt. But now we have a broader Oregon-based framework to work within to accomplish our goals and do that with you. And I want to thank everyone that contributed to all of that work. Lots of effort going forward. One of the things that we didn't accomplish was, well, I don't know, session's still on, Mike, but we didn't get the metric bill out. We have obligations around that. We're going to meet, one of the obligations is roughly, TJ, I know we're running a little behind, but we're going to get the average weights. We're going to make average weights usable for you this harvest season. Metric may catch up to us a little bit by the time we have it fully implemented there, but we're getting that feature already enabled in the metric system, and we are going to work very hard on the reduction of plant tags and getting the business operation costs down. Understand that was an objective there. Appreciate Mike called me up and asked me. I had some trouble with the contracting and some of the flexibility on bookkeeping, right? But we have objectives to meet with the industry and with the contractor metric on one of the pieces that was very important to the industry that we didn't get out. Our obligation is to work very hard to get those efficiencies in the system for the industry, at least in two respects, with respect to the average weights and with respect to reduction of plant tags. And really appreciate the industry's support on 3000. 3000 was about face for a lot of us. And sort of Floyd Przanski carried the enforcement provisions. That's a interesting notion that we've come to with how the effects of the Farm Bill and the Opportunity Oregon has presented to folks. Appreciate that this industry stood up to that with support for action. I hope our actions are effective. We're going to work very hard with ODA to get some control over that, the unregulated or non-state sanctioned, in any case, grows that are out there. And I think it's vitally important. I think there's nothing that set back our objectives for nationalization further than what has happened with Delta 9 and the hemp and Farm Bill experience. So hopefully we get some corrections from the Congress in that, and then can figure out how to move forward.
Steve, could you speak to why enforcement of federal prohibition is a state issue and why we don't just leave that to the feds?
No, I'm enforcing the idea that you have a state, your industry has the state license for growing marijuana. I'm not enforcing federal prohibition, and they're free riding on your system. They're skirting us.
Well, the point about state prohibition was to end arrests and prosecutions. And what 3000 does is it doubles the amount of money that goes to these yahoos down in Southern Oregon to continue arrests and prosecutions. I mean, I worked on this for 25 years, so I didn't have to practice criminal law anymore. And this is going to keep me in it. And so I'm just disappointed about that, and thought this might be an appropriate time to discuss it with you.
Well, and I don't know how much of it's going to be arrests and prosecutions as it is to getting rid of the marijuana plants that shouldn't be grown there.
There's lots of ways to do that without arrests and prosecutions. Anyway, and again, I think it's only because if there wasn't federal prohibition, there wouldn't be this issue. And I think it's their problem, and I don't understand why the state is involved.
And we'd have 70-acre pre-done marijuana grows all set to roll.
Say again?
I think that's an advantage on your limited system. I mean, so.
There's no reason for having a license system then. We would just have unregulated marijuana growing everywhere.
Yeah, and this is the one spot where I love to argue with Mr. Berger, and we've been back and forth on this for years. But hey, the reason that we pay all of these extra costs to be part of the OLCC system is because not for fear of enforcement, frankly, it's because it buys us a monopoly on access to the market. And that's kind of the contract inherent in participating in a highly regulated system. So, you know, if you guys aren't taking these strong steps, and this is why we supported 3000 and frankly worked on it. You know, it's the right thing to do if people are growing black market cannabis and not going through the process of getting licensed. I don't want to compete with them. And if that means that they get arrested for breaking that law while it's against the law, then I'm okay with that.
You know, I'd like to add my 2 cents to that. Down here in Southern Oregon, Lee, there's organizations that need to be stopped. They are ruining the landscape. They are running the creeks dry. They are making communities dangerous. I love marijuana. It's not about that. And I love freedom too. But there's organizations that need to be stopped down here. It's a big.
Cedar, I don't disagree with any of that. And my disagreements with Mike have always been without being disagreeable to each other. But I just think it's the Fed's problem and we ought to let them deal with it. I know, for example, when there were people who were robbing people who are growing in the traditional market, that the feds have been prosecuting those cases, for example, where there's actual, violence and threats of violence and actual crime besides growing a plant.
Well, Mr. Berger, Lee, I just have to step in. I'm sorry. Cedar and I live it down here, and some of us are fearful for our lives on what is happening. Like, this is very easy to say coming from the north, but this is a real issue down here, and it is our livelihoods. It is our neighbors. There are deaths and human trafficking and murders, and the cartel is an entirely different scenario than someone wanting to grow a few plants on their property. So it's a little tone deaf, Mr. Berger, I'm sorry, on what's actually happening here. And I invite you to sit on any of our Josephine County Cannabis Advisory panels where we discuss this, the sheriff gives updates, and you hear actual statistical data. And I'm happy to invite you. We have one on June 30th, and I would love for you to join us to understand exactly what is going on down here.
I'd be glad to.
Josephine County too.
I did that already. I just want to be clear, Amanda. I don't disagree that there are problems going on. I disagree that it's the state's problem. I think it's the federal government's problem, and that the enforcement ought to be coming from them. That's my position, and that's just what I wanted to throw out there.
I appreciate that, Lee, and I appreciate the old sentiment, quite frankly, and I respect it, actually. But I got to say, my issue is I think the feds will recognize it, and they'll say, yeah, those states that have control of their marijuana systems can participate in interstate commerce, and those that don't can't. And that's
as a North Oregon provider of services to cannabis companies, I worry about it from a state standpoint too. If we don't if we don't keep our own state clean, it's going to be harder to go anywhere else. So clearly, very support the farmers.
Sorry to interrupt. I tend to do that once in a while on these, and my apologies. But
I appreciate this conversation, and I know that it's my view is a minority view, but I appreciate you all hearing what I had to say. Thanks.
I just want to say one of my reasons why I've been we've been pushing the regulations and keeping in line and making it happen and holding the box is because I think that us demonstrating that we have a box is important to that day of interstate commerce opening soon. If I didn't believe that, it might be in a different place, but I think it's materially important to demonstrate that control to lead us to interstate commerce. So.
I heard that loud and clear. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
But if there's a situation that requires the legislature to authorize the governor to bring in the National Guard in order to enforce our state laws, then that sounds like a pretty big federal issue to me. So, and so I agree that there's a major issue. I've been looking at it at the federal level as well. And Lee, I agree that, the time has come. We can't just ignore a federal issue when you've got international drug cartels coming in and dominating the market. So,
Well, I mean, the other issue is that they're using ODA licenses and not growing hemp behind those. So it is a state issue. You're getting a state license and not using your license for what that license purpose is, and you're masking it. And so there is an issue at the state level beyond everything else that's already been stated. So, I mean, we also have to kind of not ignore that part of the situation and why this bill was created.
Oh, I understand that, and I understand that the Josephine County Sheriff's Office regularly says that that's the case, that people are growing hemp instead of, or growing cannabis that's not hemp when they have an ODA license, and they come and they seize and they destroy, and it turns out to actually be hemp, and people sue in federal court and get no relief. So I just think the Josephine County Sheriffs have been out of control. Of 35 years I've been going down there, or 25 years I've been going down there since '96 on criminal cases, and I just think empowering them is the wrong move. I don't think it's. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm not saying it's never the case where people are using ODA licenses. I'm not saying it's entirely possible there's cartels. I'm not saying Amanda doesn't have a good reason to be afraid. I am saying my perspective on it is it's a federal issue. Although I appreciate Steve's comments about, by showing that we are, robustly enforcing the regulated system by working to make sure that people aren't operating outside of it. Not only does it, achieve Mike's concern so that he's not competing with somebody that doesn't have to pay the money to do the regulatory stuff he has to do, but it puts us in a better position for post-legalization, about the feds looking more favorably on us. I appreciate that point of view as well. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lee. I just want to say everyone should, concerned about this, should definitely watch ODA's implementation, and we're doing our part and trying to get the field testing machines so we can get on and determine, whether we see commercial marijuana on this hemp farm. I'm not trying to determine whether it's really hemp, but really determine whether there's a commercial level of marijuana on those farms. So I'm hopeful, if it was left to us, we'd run and gun and do a lot of testing as quickly as possible. I think we're going to be ready to go the second week of July on our end. Hopefully our rules are ready to go. We are still working with our coordination with ODA to make that all happen, what the state's asked us to do through 3,000. So we'll look to keep you all informed.
Hey, Lee, I have to agree that I'd like to solve the problem without empowering the Josephine County Sheriffs.
Yeah, and Steve, I'd like to point out, I've got friends and family down there who are scared. They've told me that for months now in Southern Oregon. But I also want to point out that it's something troubling I've heard. ODA showed up on one person's farm and they told them, they were surprised that the person who they talked to was a white person. They racially profiled the farm. Somebody saw, Mexican-American workers there. And so, the ODA came to that place and the ODA basically admitted, to my client that the only reason they stopped by was because they thought this was, they were racially profiling these people to be part of a cartel. And so I am really concerned that that is going to happen to be, again, like we see everywhere in the United States, selective prosecution and racially profiling. So please be careful.
Paul, I can assure you that race won't be in the criteria, and the criteria will get us on all those large grows. Size, they didn't test last year, whether they have complaints on water, virtually the whole set. There's a large set of work inside that criteria that is not race-based at all. But it'll be prolific opportunity to test. Hopefully we'll find everyone's growing hemp and walk away and be happy. But the criteria is quite broad that we're using, and it's a pretty big set that it'll take in. So there'll definitely be priorities in that. But I think you'd expect that one of the priorities for the state would be large grows. The other would be unpaid for, unpermitted hoop houses, and no testing for prior years reporting in the system. So as a sort of a base of criteria, there's plenty of other criteria that we're going to be combining up that doesn't include race, but it's going to get us on all grows.
Okay, yeah, this report, because they basically said that, your little problem here, don't worry about it, you're a white person. So, and they were appalled by that. So that's why they called me.
I'd be appalled by that too.
Great, thank you. So the last thing that we have on the agenda for today, we have Anthony Taylor with us, and the Oregon Cannabis Commission has a few different subgroups that are working on ways, well, a subgroup in question is working on medical marijuana access for patients within the recreational system. And the actual recommendations from the commission have not come to OLCC yet, but they will be soon. And so we asked Anthony to come and kind of talk about those recommendations just informally and get the group thinking about ways where we can encourage patient access through our license system. So nothing that we have to have answers on today, but things just kind of to start us thinking about the patients and their needs, and then maybe what tools OLCC may be able to use to encourage that access. So Anthony, if you don't mind, it's all yours.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it. Good afternoon to everyone here. What a great conversation you've had. I can't imagine trying to sort some of this stuff out, but with everybody's help and input, I think there'll be a path forward. I'd just like to make a quick comment before I get into what I'm here about today is that, excuse me, I participate in the grow site in Southern Oregon in Williams, and it is a great deal of concern down there. Not everybody, but people are fearful, and I trust that we'll work through it, but I do worry about that if, as Lee holds, that it is actual a federal issue. I worry about the feds coming in because I know how many years we suffered through that in Southern Oregon, the raids and all that. So I would just urge caution as we proceed down that path. I know it needs to be straightened out. I know people, the water issues, the land disruption, those are big issues for everyone. So with that, I'll go ahead and talk about why I'm here. So the Oregon Cannabis Commission 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, created some standing subcommittees, and one of those was Patient Equity Subcommittee. And a couple of things we did was we took surveys. We started with Leafly and looked at some menus, and then we called. We had 3 or 4 people doing this, and each of them called 10 stores and asked certain questions about prices and availability of product and being able to find what you want to as a patient, availability of the full scope of products, from suppositories to just flour. And we found that the patients are really struggling out there in the retail marketplace, as well as in the processing and the producing part of the license structure. But in the stores especially, many of the stores still use the tax included in their prices, making it difficult for patients to determine, if they're really receiving their tax exemption. Sometimes it's hard to find products that you really need in the quantity you need. For instance, you can have a 4,000 milligram package of THC with a package with 4,000 milligrams of THC in them, but you very rarely find those products in the stores. And these are, it's market driven because those aren't high, they don't move very quickly. And so to have them sitting on the shelf is not very profitable, taking up valuable space where they could be making money from. So perhaps let me catch my train of thought here. So what we're trying to do, the ultimate goal of these recommendations is get the OLCC and their licensees, producers, processors, and retailers to sit down and have a conversation of how to get back to low or no cost cannabis for qualifying patients. Because, excuse me, because 60% of our patients right now qualify for a reduced card fee, And that means that they qualify for state assistance, federal assistance, SNAP, OHP, SSI, veterans, and they can't afford the prices in the stores. They can't afford to have their own product that they may have produced in, in their own greenhouse or on their own property, to have it tested to see if it was inadvertently contaminated. They can't afford processing, which includes testing on the front end, testing on the back end. So some of these issues, we would look to the OLCC to try and figure out, maybe establish a pilot program where some of these costs can be subsidized. And I know that everybody's on a razor thin margin. Many of the stores are just hanging on by their fingernails with no opportunity to declare bankruptcy and get out from under it, and all the things that you folks discussed earlier in the meeting. But costs are driving us into markets that we shouldn't be in. And finding ourselves in that position is not safe for any of us. It's not good for the state to put the patients in those positions, and it's not good for the patients to be in those positions. So what it really boils down to is, despite any of these recommendations that come over, subsidizing the cost of processing and testing, developing annual training for your your counter personnel, examining and adjusting packaging limits for patients, because right now all the limits for the only limit that is not the same as a non-patient is flour. You can buy more flour than a non-patient, but everything else is the same. And being able to get the full spectrum of products. So maybe we figure out how to subsidize that so that, there's a central location where, 500 milligram THC suppositories are available on order. And you drop ship it into the local dispensary of the patient, just like Amazon does. And that way the dispensary doesn't have to take up valuable shelf space. It's available almost on demand, and we have access to that. Another idea could be that since you can't go into a retail store and buy the 24-ounce cannabis flower that you're allowed to buy, maybe we should set it up so that a wholesaler could deal with that particular crowd, but specifically caregivers with multiple patients that have to have larger quantities, and shouldn't be forced into going to a store 4 or 5 days in a row to get what they need to produce products for their patients. So these are just some ideas that have come up through conversations about this. We recognize that some of these recommendations coming over will require statutory changes, such as allowing a medical grower to transfer patient or product to a processor to be processed for patients downline. That would be a statutory change, because right now only a patient or caregiver can take that product to a processor, and things like that. There will also be rule changes and policy changes. But what we really need is the OLCC to work with us, work with their licensees to, come up with some solutions on this, and to really start to advocate for the patient again. I know we're not going to get back to dispensaries like when they first started, where you could go in and get a massage or acupuncture, or you could get a consult on how to make a particular product. I know those days are gone by, but it doesn't mean that we have to leave the patients out completely. And we have the capacity to meet some of their needs, and we really need to start doing that. And I would just really urge the commission themselves and their licensees to sit down and have this conversation, because that's really we're dying out here. The low-income patients, they can't make it.
Thank you, Anthony. So kind of just to start the conversation, that's why we wanted to bring it to this group, to see if people have thought about this or have heard of ways that licensees are helping patients or providing low cost or free product throughout the state.
Hi, this is Erin from Kindly Pendleton, and I just want to chime in on this topic. I personally don't feel like this is a state issue. This is the licensees who own the stores. Because at Kindly, for one of the largest dispensaries in Oregon, we donate products to patients. We give it out for free when they need it, and they come and demonstrate to Brandon and I that they need it. We extend a 15% discount on top of the tax-free at all times. We've brought in oil from Siskiyou Sungrown specifically for patients who reached out to them. We have offered to facilitate large purchases under medical cards. So it's really not the state's issue. It's the dispensary owners. And, retail is taxed at the worst level. Like, we're the hardest hit. We don't have the ability to sacrifice a lot of our profits. And it's really unfortunate, but the producers are also not willing to extend discounts to us for medical patients. Every discount I give to medical patients is a discount off of our profit. I've never ever been offered a discount from a grower for medical patients, even on medical products. With that being said, medical dosed products are extremely difficult for us at retail to carry because they look exactly like the regular products, and it confuses bud tenders, and it poses a risk to our business because a bud tender could accidentally grab the wrong edible and sell a 100 milligram edible out to a Rex customer because that edible looks exactly the same as the 50 milligram Rec with just a small little M on it. And so for us, it's an extreme risk to even carry medical dose products, so we don't do that. And then one of the biggest problems with medical patients that we encounter is that they don't have access to enough oil. They need to be able to purchase more than 5 grams. So in Eastern Oregon, we get a lot of Idaho people that come over, and they have their cards. They're able to get their medical cards here in Oregon, and they want to purchase 10 grams of oil, but they have to spend the night and make 2 trips, and that's really a burden to them. So some of the things that the state could look at is maybe increasing that concentrate and extract limit, or maybe requiring medical dosed products to look substantially different than the recreational products.
I couldn't agree more. And everything you talked about, every point you made is a point we've all heard before in these subcommittees, and why it's important that everyone, the licensees, sit down and figure out how to make this work for patients. Because patients have gone from being the dominant force in this state to being exploited to get to legalization, to being marginalized in access to products that they need. And that's why I mentioned creating a central place where if a patient needs 5 grams of oil, they can go to call ahead to their dispensary. The dispensary places it with a central location. That location distributes it, transfers it out to that dispensary. The patient comes in and picks it up. And what we're trying to say as patients is, look, y'all got to help us here. You got to sit down and figure out how to make this work. I know everybody's on tight margins, and there are ways through this, but until y'all sit down and figure it out, us patients are out here trying to figure out how we're going to come up with, $3,000 a month to buy the oil we need in the dispensary. And I really commend Kindleaf because they are doing great work. But the problem is that nobody else is stepping up. The producers, the processors are not stepping up, even though the pathways are there. And it's making it hard for people like the people at Kindleaf and other people like Flower of Life in Eugene that was doing this, and a couple of the ones in Southern Oregon. They can't get the product, and nobody wants to participate. So somebody's got to sit down and figure this out for patients, because we're really struggling.
I have a specific suggestion for a starting point. I mean, as Anthony and Aaron point out, there are 3 or 4 retailers statewide that have enacted compassionate use programs, at least that I'm aware of. There may be more. but they're, you know, entirely voluntary. They often involve only, or they involve only flour. Often the flour is, at least at some of the retail stores, the flour is donated by the growers as a goodwill gesture. I know that the agency tried to address this by using a carrot approach in allowing expanded I forgot the word, canopies, expanded canopies for production sites, and there was only one application, is my recollection. My suggestion is that we use a stick approach. I think when, you know, given the conversation we had about licensing already, licenses are valuable in several ways, including not being subject to arrest and prosecution. And there ought to be a requirement for some percentage of what's cultivated to be donated to retail stores, and the retail stores, as a condition of their license, need to be required to distribute what's donated from the producers without charge to those 60% of the patients that have this low card. I think the oil issue and the packaging issue, I think the packaging issue can be addressed administratively, including the Amazon-like thing, I think can be addressed administratively. I think the problem around, you know, the quantities and the growers for multiple patients that are now going to be required to, you know, be in metric and the rest of it, ought to be able to, I think for them to be able to take access to processors, and for processors to deliver excess quantities to patients would require a statutory change, and perhaps that's one the agency can recommend in the short session in February. But so I guess those are my two suggestions. And then I don't know what the percentage is. I mean, I imagine, since there's a glut still, that it's a small percentage of what's produced. I imagine that it's something that, notwithstanding the thin margin that producers have, that it's something that they could afford. And, you know, in my experience, for the most part, people who came to legal cannabis in Oregon began from medical. Either they were involved in the medical program, or they, you know, or they were a guy like Jim Belushi who learned about the therapeutic value of medical cannabis afterwards. But I just I think that I think that if you can crunch the numbers, we'll come up with something that wouldn't be overly burdensome to the licensees, to producers and retailers. And if we can't, then perhaps a different incentive besides increased canopy would be a reduction in the price of the license for participation, if you wanted to continue to pursue a carrot approach rather than a stick. I asked for this committee to take this up when this first came up a year and a half ago, and I appreciate it being on the agenda now, and I appreciate the time to address these issues, and inviting Anthony to share the, you know, more broad and specific concerns that patients who are actually involved in the subcommittee have about the limitations of the retail market on their ability to obtain the therapeutic cannabis that they need. But the patients that are harmed most particularly are those who, and typically because of their illness, are indigent. And as to those patients, OLCC can and should, through administrative rule change, create a system that would mandate that their needs be addressed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I've long supported the concept of having a clearinghouse where farmers, processors, and like can donate their supply into the clearinghouse for distribution throughout the medical community. And another concept that I've talked about and had good traction during the legislative session in 2017, 2018 was to set up a fund whereby 1% of revenues of operators go into the fund, and then that 1% then is used to supplement the expenditures for medical cannabis to medical patients in need. So those are a couple of concepts that I've toyed with for several years now, but we had traction in 3 or 4 years ago, but the political dynamic within the industry was such that nobody could agree to it. And so it was poised with Senator Burdick. She was ready, but it just kind of fell apart at the last moment.
I just had a question I wanted to pose to Anthony. If some people who were in the medical community have switched over to recreational, why do you think that they aren't taking it on what you're asking us to do as bumping their canopy to grow for medical? Why do you think only one entire producer in the whole entire state signed up for that option?
That's a great question. I think it's just a matter of economics. It's so tight out there for producers and processors and retailers that they just don't see a way to do it. And I know a lot of them want to, but they want to be reimbursed at some level. And so I really think it's important that the OLCC and the licensees take this conversation up and figure out a pathway through it, because we just can't survive out there when it costs $3,000 a month to get 1,000 milligrams of THC every day.
No,
And,
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
I have thought on this, Anthony. It's something I've actually thought a lot about over the last couple of years, stemming from a conversation you and I had back in 2018, I think. And our farm, as we were expanding, we actually put it out there as best we could through all the channels we had available to us. We were looking for medical patients that we could supply, and did that for about a year. Had some good conversations. The couple that we got closest with, wanted processed material and not flour, and obviously we couldn't fill that demand. And all of the others that we had talked to wanted us to, they didn't understand we were a rec grow and wanted us to pay them, X number of thousands of dollars for their cards so we could grow for them. And that was our experience. And I think there are two issues. There's the lack of economic incentive, which I think is key. And I think that's a difficult fight because to some extent somebody has to pay for it. It always has to come from somewhere. So whether it's the agency paying for it out of decreased licensure, the state paying for it out of decreased tax revenue, or us paying for it out of decreased income, somebody's got to pay for that medicine. So that's a hard one. But I think the ease of connecting, and Mr. Whitney spoke about this, but creating some sort of even just an online clearinghouse where we could just find somebody, and if I had X amount of product that, one of the great examples is a test batch overage for a producer, right? If we've got 15.5 pounds of something, I'm not going to run a half a pound test batch, and a lot of the time that just gets wasted out. And so at the end of the year, there are ways to do it, but I think the real question is logistics. So how do we get the people that need it in touch with people like with us that can provide this product? And so, I think the low-hanging fruit is probably the ease of access, and the more difficult argument is probably the economic incentives. And I'd be very game to try and work on something like that with you, and figure out how we can make that connection.
I appreciate that, Mike, and I appreciate the conversations we've had over the last couple of years. It's interesting that you talk about the waste out, because that's very relevant. And I got a call from Bioscience a couple of months ago. They have all kinds of product available every quarter that they would like to donate. It's unprocessed, but it's mature flower. So, again, the point is, it comes back to we have to figure this out. And if it means we, and the OLCC has to advocate for some of these changes, because there's a path for the process for the OMMP grower to get product to a processor, and then a processor to get that to the patients. But it's so costly right now for a patient that it's insurmountable, as is testing their own product. If they have, they grew their 6 plants and they didn't know that their, neighbor had sprayed some kind of pesticide that floated over and contaminated their product. So these are all things and all good questions and good areas to explore, but we really have to sit down and work through it. And so that's what, not all the recommendations that are coming over don't cover everything, but again, it's to precipitate this conversation that we're beginning right now to find these pathways. I know Director Marks and I have had these conversations over the years. It was one of his ideas to create a regional distribution system. And, for patients, this clearinghouse, this kind of Amazon delivery approach could work very effectively, and it could keep these patients supplied in the products they need in a safe manner to everyone. And there won't be a confusion at the counter that somebody just sold a non-patient 4,000 milligram syringe of, 90% THC oil. So that's really all these recommendations are to provide that start for the conversation.
Thank you.
This is Erin from Kind Leaf again, and I just wanted to chime in and say it took a lot of advocacy to get to where we are today in our industry, and I think it's going to take a lot more advocacy, but with federal legalization, we will be able to utilize health insurance, health savings accounts, things like that for purchasing marijuana. And I do have customers that come in and save their receipts for their health savings accounts. I think that sometimes we are afraid as patients, and when we're using this for healthcare, we're afraid to turn it into our health savings accounts. But there are, as a dispensary, I'm allowed to participate in tax-free, providing tax-free insurance, pre-tax insurance to my employees. We have a lot of rights, and it's taken a lot of advocacy to get here. So I think that this conversation is putting a lot of pressure on the state and the OLCC, whereas maybe this is something that we're going to see progress when federal legalization happens, so that we can, and also the dispensaries need to, and the advocates need to talk to the patients about trying other avenues of talking to their health savings accounts, things like that.
That's a great idea. And they all need to be explored, and we have to remember that it's urgent. Patients really, we've got 11,000 patients out there that have designated growers that are helping provide for them, but that's not meeting the need of the other 10 or 11 or 12,000 patients that don't have access to that. And we've kind of snatched that away from this community, and made it difficult to find growers, made it difficult to be a grower. The regulation at OHA and OLCC level for these growers has been insurmountable. In the first year, ramping up to these growers with 3 or more patients coming into the system, they had to be into the system by July of 2018. If you weren't in the system, 12 plants could all you could grow. But in the year prior to that deadline, we lost 66% of our growers. We went from 4,300 growers with 3 or more patients down to 1,400. And we can't afford that kind of loss. And so we just have to all work together, and we have to get the OLCC to advocate for us in some of this area when we do have to go to the state and say, look, we've got a pathway for these growers to get oil to their patients. And we need to write it up. And that's one of those things that could be done in the short session very easily. But it's a bigger conversation, absolutely. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to what we're talking about here today.
Great, thanks. So we need to wrap it up here pretty quickly. So I can take a couple really quick comments, but then what I was going to ask is that if people had additional comments or ideas, if you just go ahead and email me. Then I can kind of keep track and we can talk about it at our kind of like give an update or talk about more concepts at our next meeting. So Cedar or Jesse, I saw both of you guys lit up. So if you had any quick comments to make, that would be great.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Cedar, you can go. I'll just go. This is not necessarily about Anthony Taylor's topic, but before we close out tonight, I did want to say that the cannabis industry worked really hard this last legislative session with the OLCC and lawmakers. It was, there was a cannabis coalition of trade associations, and I think it was very productive, and I think that it was generally very encouraging to all of our members to be able to talk with and collaborate with the OLCC about beginning to undo some of the overburdensome regulations. And I just want to thank them for being willing to work with us on that, and really appreciate it, and hope that that sets the tone moving forward, because there's still a lot of work to do, but really honestly, thank you. And we look forward to continuing these conversations. I think this collaborative thing is essential for the big questions that are before this industry.
Yeah, I will second that. Steve, TJ, Amanda, Jason, and Megan, all you guys. I know it's been a long haul and a long session, and we really appreciate you kind of staying the course with us and continuing to work stuff through. So we're trying to be helpful and trying to create a balance. And I feel, I think a lot of us feel like we're really very close to that for the first time now. And we just really appreciate the partnership and all the hard work. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, Anthony, for being a tireless champion for the patients.
You're welcome.
All right, great. Steve, I saw you lit up as well. Did you have any final remarks?
A couple. I wanted to wrap up on Anthony a little bit. Been a while since I've seen him, and I am really interested. I've been interested in this topic for a long time. We wanted to do the pilot program. We made efforts right around that time, but the economy kind of knocked us down. Our economy inside our system, I think, knocked us down. So, the national organization I'm a part of has a lot of medical states in it, right? And they're struggling. Medical states that are going rec are struggling with the same kinds of things, getting patient products in place. And I really think that a couple things still are truisms for the deal. Healthcare for indigents generally is subsidized, right, by the government in some way. I really do think it comes not out of the hide of retailers, but out of the hide of our revenues to help move this system ahead for us. The other part that's, sorting clear is medical is, as you look at federalization, is like FDA medical, right? They're thinking of that. But then there's the medicinal medical, what we've got, and we've got to figure out how that sets in our marketplace so people can access those kinds of things that they've been using and want to be able to use in Oregon. So I look forward to working with you on re-advancing some of those ideas and ideas that don't have to be a burden on our retailers, but move our system, but move the issue forward. I'm still stuck on the idea, Anthony, that I don't want cards related to grows and plants, as you well know, but where we probably differ. But I think it's a great, timely discussion, because we're getting to that evolution of our program here, which is my second closing comment is thank you, industry, again, for everything you did. Appreciate the remarks. I think it was remarkable what we really accomplished, given what we could have been doing, right? We could have been at loggerheads all session long, and we weren't. I mean, we produced some really good advancements for our budget, for licensing, for our systems going forward, and certainly on violations. And I just want to call out, I want to mention Rich did a ton for us, obviously, to lift up our progress on violations. That work is not done. We still got rulemaking, and Madeline's going to fold a lot of that together here for us. So we should have a program for you to keep working on violations and everything else we got to do. But I do think we should plan a celebration of this session somewhere along the line out here, other than just as the advisory group. I think the accomplishments here of the legislature and us working together are noteworthy, and I'd like to see a lot more of it continue well into the future. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Steve. So with that, we're a minute early. We can be done. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your feedback and the conversation. It's very helpful.